Well, good morning, everybody. Guys awake? I know you're warm. It's funny because some of you are here today and you're like, I got this invitation in the mail and that's awesome. And so we're glad that you're here today. And then, I got some other friends in the room that they've been coming for a little bit and they're just like, always ask me, they're like, so what kind of church are you? Like, what kind of church is this? And they said, maybe I grew up in the, kind of like that frozen, chosen church and, like you just sit in the pew because you have an aisle and a thing and you can't move out of that. And you just sit there and you can't move your hands, you can't move your body. It's just like you're totally still. You don't laugh, you don't do any of that. Others of you, you're like, well, I grew up in the happy clappy, everything is, and all this kind of stuff. And so they're like, well, what kind of church are you? Well, today I'm just letting you know we're the hot and humid church, okay? Because welcome to Florida, and we're glad that you're here. But my name is Peter. I'm the pastor, and we're thrilled that you're here. I do want to just let you know a few things. First off, parents in the room, we have been working with the facilities manager, the janitors, and they're doing everything they can to get the air back on. We have fans in all the rooms right now. And we're doing everything that we can there. After church today, we do want to make sure that you guys cool down, so we've got the ice cream truck coming. Exactly. So, if you're tempted to nod off at all, just be thinking ice cream, ice cream, ice cream. And so be picking that ice cream out even right now as we're talking in your head. I recommend the Chipwich. But you do what you want, all right? You do what you want. But so here's the thing. Here is what is true about our church. We typically have AC, and it typically works really well. But the other thing I want you to know is that we believe that church is a place to have fun. We believe that church can be fun, that church has been endured for far too long and not enjoyed. And we want to do something about that. We also know that that following Jesus doesn't mean that you have to be super pious and super formal, but that following Jesus means that it goes into every aspect of your life and it changes every bit about you. And so in the midst of this series, we're going to be talking about the Red Letter Challenge. You heard us mention that in just a little bit ago, and we're kicking that off today, and it's going to be great. But church is kind of a funny thing, right? Like, church is one of those things where you're not really sure what to expect. You're not sure what that place is going to be like, and sometimes you show up at a church, and maybe, first off, you're like, I haven't been to church in years. It's a miracle. Like, is this thing going to stay up? Like, I don't know if it's going to fall in because I walked into a church building. Listen to me. We're glad that you're here. But many of us have an impression of church, or we have some kind of, we've formed something in our mind around what church could be like because of an experience that you had, or because of somebody, a church person that you knew, or because of maybe a scene in a movie that you watched, right? Like, anybody disappointed when their church choir came out and Whoopi Goldberg wasn't in it, right? Like, Sister Act, she wasn't leading the charge, doing her thing, and like it wasn't breaking it down. Like, I had like Sister Gertrude in my choir growing up, and she had like a broken hip and she shouldn't even be singing, right? Couldn't sing on key. Who let her on stage, right? But that's the kind of the reality that we have. The rub with church is that sometimes we form impressions of God and God's church based around some of our previous experiences and some of God's people that we've met. See, sometimes I think that what is represented about God looks nothing like God. It's too easy for us, these days, like any of you in this room, to say whatever you want and pose as an expert on the subject, right? Like, for example, when I lived up north, I lived up in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and New York. And so when I was up there, I knew one weatherman, and he was on TV. I moved to Florida. I know 400 weathermen, and they're on Facebook. All of you, right? Like, all of you are like, I'm a certified weatherman, right? Or I'm a meteorologist. Why? Because you learned 3 words, right? You learned this one, spaghetti model. You're like, I've seen the spaghetti model. I checked it this morning, and it looks like Dorian is going to go up the coast, and we're going to be fine. Or you learned another word, right? Rain band. So, I was thinking today that the rain bands are going to be shifting in, and we're going to be experiencing some weather today. Well, thank you, meteorologist, right? Like, okay. Or here's one that I learned in Dorian. I'm like next level meteorologist now. Wobble. Okay? I didn't know that one before Dorian, but now I do, and I'm basically Jim Cantori, okay? So this is the reality. For you and for me, is that there are times in our life when we represent ourselves as being something that we're not, simply because of something that we've said. In other words, here's another way of putting it. Just because we say something doesn't mean we are something. You could have gone to church your entire life and have missed who Jesus is. You could have gone to church your entire life and missed who the people of God are, based upon some of your experiences and some of the things that you've endured throughout your life. You know, I met my wife in college, and before I even met her, I was like, girl, we're getting married. She didn't know my name yet, but I was like, it's going to happen. You're about to get a name change. It's going to be awesome, and all this kind of stuff. But minor details aside, we went through the first 4 months of college because she was like, I'm not dating you until I see like if you're really going to be serious about this thing. And so, you know, one day I was like, I'm going to impress this woman because she needs to know how much I value her and think of her and all this kind of stuff. And so I did my very best. I went into my closet and I picked out one of those baseball tees. You know what I'm talking about? They're like, they got one color on the chest and another on the arms, and it said Abercrombie right across the front of it because I was doing that thing, and I had my Eddie Bauer jeans on, and I tucked that shirt straight into my jeans and laced up that belt that probably was a braided belt if we're real. And I was like ready to go. I was strutting down campus, and I made sure that she saw me that day, and I was trying to impress her. And then we were doing this thing. It was going really well. Like there was momentum on my side. And then do you know what happened? Was winter break came along. And winter break was going to separate us for like a month. And I said, listen, I'm driving to your house whenever. You name the time. It doesn't matter. I'm going to meet you at your house. I want to meet your family. I want to meet your parents, all this kind of stuff. It's going to be fantastic. They're going to love me, right? I know it. And so she said, okay, come on over. We set up the time, set up the place. And I rolled up to her house in the best clothes that I had. They were mint. They looked fresh. I probably got it for Christmas that year. And it was a J. Crew roll neck, turtleneck sweater, okay? And so it's like rolled up the arms, like a big chunky thing, and then it's up my neck like this, which is very, very fashionable. And I ring the doorbell, and who shows up to the front door is none other than her father. And I'm like, hello, sir, right? Like I do that whole thing, and he shows up. He's got this like Hurley hooded sweatshirt on, some Billabong jeans, and some like surfer hat, kind of cocked a little bit to the side to prove to the world around him like I'm a little bit cooler than the rest of you. And I'm like, oh, this is not good. This is not going to go well because I was not fitting in with exactly who her family was. I figured out pretty quickly that her entire family surfed for like all the days of their life, right? If you've never met my father-in-law, this is the best way for me to sum him up. He's King Triton from The Little Mermaid, okay? Except he has legs and he shaves his head. But he has a chest like this big, like arms like this. And I came home and I said to my brother-in-law, I go, it's pretty bad when like the girl that you're interested in dating, like her dad's cooler than you, right? Like that's pretty bad, right? He's like, yeah, you're done. And so I did what everybody else would do in that situation. I went out and quickly bought a surfboard. I went out and quickly bought some surf wax. I bought everything that you needed to do to become a surfer. But I was a terrible surfer, like awful. Like they still make fun of me to this day. There's a picture of me surfing and I'm looking like this. Like full on, my arm is twisted over. My father-in-law still is like, bro, what is up with that hand, right? Like there's the surfer, like, bro. And, okay, we got the language down, but I can't actually surf. My thought was this, and we do this all the time, is that we look to get attention, we look to gain acceptance, and we look to grow in affirmation, and we're going to do everything that we can in order to do these things. We do this not only in relationships with other people, but we do this in our relationships with God. Sometimes you and I, we structure our hobbies in order to get attention from people. We'll also we'll structure our certain habits to gain acceptance. If I do this, I'm going to fit in. And then we put in the hours in order to grow in affirmation where other people are like, oh, yeah, I see that about you. We can go through life, and this is the primary way that we relate to one another, but not only to one another, but also to God. We'll do things and we'll say, well, God, have I gotten your attention yet? God, have I got your acceptance? Do I have your love? Because look at what I've done, right? Or, we'd say, God, can I get some affirmation from your people? I'm trying to impress your followers. This is exactly the way that you and I operate. When we say things like, I'm a meteorologist. No, you're not. You just know a few things. You know what to say at the right time. And see, this is what religion does. Religion says, here's a list of rules. Here's a list of do's and don'ts. And if you follow them perfectly, you'll earn God's love. You'll get God's attention, gain God's acceptance, and grow in God's affirmation. See, religion is man's way of working towards God. But Jesus is God's way of working towards man, of coming down to man. Now, religion frees you from the need to think, because religion just says, just do this prescribed thing. Do that, God will be happy. It kind of is this thing that says, go and do. Whereas the gospel, it frees you from what others think. It says, hey, come and see. Come and see, see who Jesus is. See what Jesus has done for you and for me. And that is exactly what we want to do in this series, the Red Letter Challenge. We want to come and see. We want to be introduced to Jesus in his words. And here at Hope City, we take Jesus' words very seriously. In fact, John 10:10, it says this. It says that the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. But I've come that they may have life and have life to the full, right? So for the next 40 days, we're going to take Jesus at his words, and we're going to say, okay, what kind of a life do you have for all of us? This morning, I want to invite you to turn with me to Matthew chapter 7. That's on page 662 in the Bibles that are on your chairs today. And this is the very end of a message that Jesus shares with his disciples, or with those guys that he has become best friends with. And so here at the end of this message, which is actually the Sermon on the Mount, is the largest collection of Jesus' teachings, all in one spot, right? The largest recording of Jesus' teaching. And here at the end of this message, or the message on the mountain, as I like to call it, we find Jesus presenting this one main idea. I'm going to give you the main idea, and then we're going to unpack it a little bit together. And the question that he's essentially asking here is, after he's taught all this stuff, 2-3 chapters worth of content, he ends with this story. And basically the question at the end of this is, so what's going to guide your life? What is the thing that's going to guide your life? Is it going to be your desires, or is it going to be God? So look at the story that Jesus shares with his disciples, with his best friends. He says, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall because it had its foundation built on the rock. Do you see what's going on here? There's something here that couldn't be more appropriate for us today, based upon what we've experienced in the weather lately, right? See, the rains fell, the rivers rose, the winds blew and beat against the house. Essentially, Jesus is describing a hurricane. He's saying, look at what comes into town. This hurricane comes in, blows everything. The floodwaters come up, the rain's coming down, and it's kind of like the Three Little Pigs story, right? Like this thing huffed and puffed and tried to blow the house down, and it didn't happen because this builder, this contractor, built his house on bedrock. He built his house on a foundation. Jesus goes on and he finishes the story with this. He goes, but everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. See, this same storm is experienced by two people. The same rain, the same wind, the same flooding. But each contractor had a different result. This guy here, his house collapsed and it was blown away. See, there were two houses, two men, and one storm. Jesus is not telling us this story because he wants us to say, well, one guy worked really hard and the other guy was really lazy. No, you'd be missing it. You'd be totally missing it. In fact, Jesus says that this guy, his house is still standing because he heard my words and obeyed them. Whereas this guy, he heard my words and did nothing with it. And his house blew away. See, the other guy, the other man's house was gone because of his reaction and his response to Jesus' words. Now, one of the things that you and I need to understand about this story is Jesus is revealing a very important point for us. And it may seem baseline or basic to you, but what Jesus is telling us is that everyone builds on a foundation. All of us. From the very beginning, from the day that you left your mama's house, you got on the bus, you grabbed your lunch sack, and you went off to school, you were building on a foundation. The day that you stepped into 6th grade, you scanned the lunchroom, and you said, I'm going to sit over there with those people. You were building a foundation. When you left college, you set out on a career and you made a decision of how you were going to run your life. You were building on a foundation. And from that day all the way to this one, every decision that you make is building and creating off of a foundation. See, Jesus shares this story not to show us that one person didn't work hard, but it's that they worked hard on the wrong stuff. They built an entire house on the wrong spot. See, everybody gets somewhere in life, but few people get there on purpose. When Tiffany and I were first married, we were living in New Jersey, a coastal community, very similar to Sarasota. And we were working in this little church. I was a youth pastor, and we loved it. We loved life. And we actually intentionally had people, we invited people into our life to kind of help us and figure out how do we do this thing? How do we stay married? How do we love one another? How do we raise kids? And all that kind of stuff. And there was one couple in particular that was really, really great to us. They loved us. We loved them. And I would call them mentors in our life. And one day, our lives, Tiffany and I, they got rocked straight to the core. Because I got a phone call. Somebody on the other end of the line said, "Hey, I've got to tell you that this individual, the gentleman that I was just sharing with you about, he actually has been caught having an affair with the church secretary." And for those of you that are like, "I'm new to church, but I've already heard that story," yeah, it was just as bad as that. And so here's the problem for me is I looked at this person and I was like, this guy's been following Jesus. This guy I thought was loving his wife. This guy was doing everything right. He was successful in life. He was running a great business. And yet, his world fell apart. And Tiffany and I, in that moment, we were not even married 2 years yet. In that moment, we looked at each other and we said, how does this not happen to us? Because we'd be fools to think that it couldn't happen to us. But how does it not happen to us? What do we do now to ensure that this doesn't happen tomorrow? Essentially, we were asking a question that we didn't even know to ask yet, but we were saying, what are we going to build the foundation of our marriage on? What are we going to do differently in order to make sure that this house, this marriage doesn't crumble and fall when the first rain comes, when the flood comes, or when the wind starts beating against that house? And guys, I got to tell you that after being a pastor for 17 years now, I've seen people build the foundation of their life on several different things. I've seen them build the foundation of their life on money. And guess what? 2008 happened. Anybody remember 2008? Some of you a little bit more than others, because guess what? It was a tough year if you built your foundation on money. Some people have built their foundation on comfort. They said, I'm going to do everything I can to be as comfortable as possible. Others have built their foundation on sexual pleasure and saying, I'm just going to chase whatever my desires are. And other people have just said, you know what, I'm going to do it all for personal gain. And I want to remind you that Jesus actually invites us into a better way, a better life, a better thing. And my question for you, though, is what are you building your life on? Because everybody builds on a foundation. What is your foundation? What is that foundation? What is at the core of who you are? And are you comfortable with that? Because it may be possible to succeed by the standard of culture and fail by the standard of heaven. But let's get back. Let's look at these two builders. Because little is known about these two guys, for sure. Like, we don't know their names. We just know them kind of as individuals. One that listened to the words of Jesus and one that put them into practice. But we don't really know a whole lot more. But Jesus says this in Matthew 7:24. He says, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. We do know. Here's what we do know about these guys. Is that one of these guys was willing to do incredibly hard work, while the other guy wasn't. I worked for a construction company for a few years when I was going through college, and I'm telling you, living in Pennsylvania, kind of near some of the Appalachian Mountains and some of those foothills and all that stuff, construction work and digging in particular was one of the hardest things that you could do. It was one of the hardest parts of that job because you were digging down to bedrock. You were digging down to that solid place, that firm foundation. And my dad caught wind of the fact that, you know what, this guy can work and he's looking for money. And so he said, hey, Peter, I'll pay you to dig a French drain off on this side of the property right over here, but it's got to be 4 feet. It's got to be 4 feet wide. It's got to be 3 feet deep and 2 feet across. Very specific. And he goes, I want you to dig that there. Well, I was digging, and it was the hardest thing that I think I've ever done in my life. Because every time I put a shovel in, it was like, tink, tink, you're hitting another rock, and then another rock, and another one. It's so ironic to me, because now, like with my kids, I'm like, hey, you guys want to go to the beach? Did everybody grab a shovel? Like, what do we do for fun here? We go dig a hole. No kid in Pennsylvania is like, hey, I'm going to go have some fun. You want to come dig a hole with me? No, nobody's doing that. Because it's hard work, right? Like this is some of the hardest work that you possibly could do. But hearing the words of Jesus and putting them into practice, it's exactly like that. It's saying, you know what, I'm going to do the hard work because Jesus' words may bring hard work, but they produce heart results. And heart results, I hate to break it to you, but very often heart results don't get the praise, they don't get the high fives, they don't get the pats on the back, because it's all internal work that very often people don't get to see. See, if you've ever built a house or you know somebody that has, you understand what I'm about to tell you, that the boring part of that job, the part that nobody's like, man, it's really exciting, you should come see my house, is when they're laying the foundation, when they're putting the concrete in place, when they're pouring that base, because there's just nothing really to see. But do you know what's actually going on inside of that concrete? There is a guy that shows up on the day when they're getting ready to pour that concrete, and he's laid out all this metal rebar. And I did a tiny little bit of research this week, and I found out that this metal, based upon how thick the concrete is, determines how thick this rebar needs to be, how many inches into the concrete, the middle of the concrete it needs to be. Because concrete in and of it by itself is not as strong as it potentially could be until it's reinforced with this rebar. Now, I've had a few friends that have built houses, and man, when you get to the end of that process, it's like, woohoo! It's the greatest day of your life, right? Like, oh, my home is here. Like, all you women are like, oh, my nest, I'm going to make this beautiful place, right? All the Pinterest and blah, blah, blah. And the guys are like, cool. And so at that day, you're like, you get the keys from the realtor, and it's just like tears and hugs and all this stuff. You know who never gets a tear-filled hug from the person? The guy that put the rebar in, okay? Nobody ever even remembers that guy. Nobody's like, oh man, the rebar guy, you should see my rebar guy. He's incredible. Like, he laid that thing out perfect, right? And yet, if the rebar guy didn't show up, your house there'd be cracks in the ceiling, the windows wouldn't open properly, doors wouldn't be, like, they wouldn't hang right, and everybody would walk into your house and be like, who built this thing? Who built this thing? I'm not buying a house from them. Simply because if that guy doesn't show up, everybody knows about it. But when he does his job properly, nobody cares. And the same thing is true in your life and in mine, because few people will see the heart work that you do in your life. Few people see the foundation that you're laying in your life until the lack of foundation is exposed, just like my friend, just like my mentor. See, it's all of the things that we do, those things that are visible to everybody else, that gets the accolades, gets the high fives, gets the praise. And so sometimes we can chase the things that feel good because everybody's affirming me at the expense of those things that are most important at doing that rebar work in our life. And see, religion is going to ask you to check boxes. It's going to say, complete tasks and assignment. See, religion, though, it gets the attention of man. But reverence gets the attention of God. And this morning, I want to encourage you in a different way. Because reverence is this deep respect for someone. It's hard to revere someone and ignore somebody at the same time. And yet this is what happens frequently with Jesus' words. On Sunday, we say one thing, we're in here, we raise our hands, we sing, we're like, oh, Jesus, you're my base, you're my foundation, you are the place from where my life comes. And then on Monday, you're like, I'm going to ignore you, Jesus, I'm going to go hang with the boys, right? Or I'm going to do this thing, it's just my little secret, nobody else has to know about it, right? But it's easy to fake religion. But it's hard to fake reverence. It's hard to actually come before God and revere him and respect God unless it's genuine and authentic. But we try and fake religion because it impresses others. And so could we just do ourselves a favor and stop being so impressed with other people? Stop being so impressed with like what they're doing, what the outside appearance looks like, and because God is actually more concerned with what does the inside look like? What does our foundation look like? And you and we can start to stack ourselves up spiritually against others and showing others up and saying things like, man, I served today a whole lot and it was no AC. Like I should get an extra sticker on my chart, right? And we can say all these different things. And yet, it's possible to just be checking religious boxes. Whereas I think God wants so much more for our lives and for you and for me than just that. This is why getting into a connect group, getting into a circle is so important. Because inside of a circle, you're known. Inside of a circle, people don't have to be impressed with you. Inside of a circle, people get to hold you accountable and they get to say, man, I'm cheering you on, I'm praying for you. I'm like, how can I help you? How can I serve you? Do you know what happens in the rest of the story, though? Look in verse 25. It says that the rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall because its foundation was on the rock. This builder, the obedient builder, he watched as rainwater fell, as floodwaters rose, and as winds beat on that house. And the hurricane hit it, and the builder witnessed a miracle of provision. Now, this may not always look like a house standing in a storm. But God, it could be like a miracle of provision could look like a relationship that you thought was done being brought back to life. Because of this, obedience brings opportunity. When you're obedient to God, you're going to see things that you may have missed out on otherwise. Like this builder, if he had not been obedient to God's word, he would not have been able to see his house stand in the midst of an incredible storm. In your life and in mine, if we're obedient to God, we will have the opportunity to see God move in miraculous ways, in ways that we never could have imagined possible. You get to break free from the weariness of religion and experience the full life that Jesus was talking about. I love this verse from Matthew chapter 11, verse 28 through 30 from the Message paraphrase. I like the way that Eugene Peterson puts it. He says, "Are you tired? Are you worn out? Are you burned out on religion? Come to me." This is Jesus speaking. He's saying, "Get away with me and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me, and you'll learn to live freely and lightly." And this is exactly what we're going to be doing for the next 5 weeks. We want to dive into the invitation from Jesus and accept the red letter challenge. See, we're going to be looking at the words of Jesus and what does he have to say? And he's got these 5 big principles. When you boil it down, that Jesus talked about 5 things periodically. And he said one of the first things he talked about was just being. Long before you ever did anything for Jesus, he was saying, would you just be with me? Come spend time with me. He invites us to just be with him. The second thing is that Jesus talks a lot about is forgiving. Jesus is all about grace. So many of us truly struggle with forgiving other people, forgiving ourselves, or even allowing to feel forgiven by God and others. And yet this is one of the things that Jesus spends so much time talking about. Another thing that Jesus talks about that we're going to dive into is the idea of serving. That after spending time with God and Jesus and seeing all that he's forgiven us from, our lives are motivated to serve him and to serve others in our community. Week 4, we're going to talk about giving because Jesus talked about the kingdom of God most. But the second thing that he talked most about was money. What do we do with money? And we're going to talk about giving. And the last thing he talked about was going. Many of Jesus' words were found wrapped up in this idea that there is something that you and I need to do, that we have a role, we have a job, we've got this mission that he's put us on to go and serve people, to go and tell them the good news of Jesus, that there is another way. This fall, for 40 days, I'm asking you to join a Connect group. In fact, inside of your program today, we've put this card, and I'm gonna invite you to take this card out to find a Connect group. We've got Connect groups that meet all around the city, all kinds of nights, and different affinity groups, age groups, all this stuff. And then you can just fill out your name, an email address, and what group you're interested in. Tear that off and drop it in the bucket on the way out there. And Missy Cooper, she's our Connect group coordinator. She'll get you all set up. You'll hear from your Connect group leader. And in fact, today, they're all out in the lobby. All of our Connect group leaders are going to be out there, and we'd love for you to meet them. Put a face to a name before you show up to a group. But I can't tell you how important this is, to be in a group throughout this Red Letter Challenge. You know, we've added 2 more groups this week from last week. We've got a women's group that's meeting on Tuesday nights with Aaron Peggs, and then we have a 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade boys group. So if you've got boys in that age grade, there's a group for them that's going to be meeting on Sunday nights with Lee Sullivan, and it's going to be awesome. We're really looking forward to this Connect group season. But for everybody in this room, we're going through this together as a church, and we've got a book out there that we'd love to put in your hands. It's called the Red Letter Challenge. We have cut the price of that book in half. It's made available for you for $10. You can follow along with us every day. There's something for you to read in that book, and we're going to get back together in these rows to discover what God has to say about our life, and then we're going to go and discuss that in our Connect group, in our circles, because circles really are better than rows. I want to invite you to find a group, find a home, find a place for you to get connected, because we know this. We know that following Jesus should cause us to look like Jesus. And if the Jesus that you've been following, or the religion, or the thing that you've been chasing, doesn't really line up with Jesus' own words about himself, then you and I were doing it wrong. And so for the next 5 weeks, we're going to dive in. We're going to look at this, because I can't even imagine. In fact, I'm looking forward to seeing what is it that God's going to reveal to me about my own life. What about Peter needs to change in order to be more like Jesus? And I have the same question for you, is what in your life, if you took Jesus at his own words, would change in your life? So remember his words in Matthew 11? Jesus inviting us. He says, "Come to me, all of you who are weary, worn out, tired, and you're weary from religion. I want to give you rest. I'll show you how to recover your life and learn the unforced rhythms of grace." Well, this morning, you may be most familiar with a God who's been represented by rules and religion. You may have a list as long as your arm of things that you've been told to do in order to make God happy and make God's people happy. Well, I want to invite you for the next 40 days, 5 weeks, to read this Red Letter Challenge with us, to listen to the words of Jesus and see, what does Jesus really want for me? Or maybe you're like me and you've been following Jesus for quite a long time in your life, and I want to encourage you for the next 40 days. Would you listen to the words of Christ, to the words of Jesus, and see, are we really following Jesus? Or are we following a more comfortable, cushy, convenient version of Christ? Maybe you're just invited here, or you responded, you got a postcard in the mail, something simple like this, and you said, "I'll give it a try, but I'm not really into this Jesus thing." You're just kind of kicking the tires of faith. Well, I'm glad that you're here. And in fact, I want to invite you for the next 40 days to just be open with your doubts, to be open with your questions, and to be willing to investigate. Who could this Jesus really be? See, together we're going to discover all that Jesus has in store for our lives. And I'd love nothing more than for you to be a part of this.